Meanwhile, Marco Rubio, and possibly the most damaging comment for Israel yesterday, said that the Israelis were planning an attack, and the Americans felt that if they didn't preemptively strike Iran, that the Americans would be hit as a result of Israel's strike on Iran, which puts Israel in a really tough spot right now. And Israel supporters here at home essentially being used as fodder by Israel critics to say that Jerusalem is controlling Washington's foreign policy. So a real messaging issue right now. What we haven't heard a lot of, Benita, is from President Trump himself. He's spoken with outlets here and there for 5-10 minutes at a time on the phone, but really has very little to say to the press beyond some pre-recorded statements. He's about to have a meeting. Actually, it's going on right now with the Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz. The press pool is supposed to enter the Oval Office soon, and hopefully we'll ask some questions about this situation and can get some more detailed answers than the administration has been giving as of late.
Thank you so much. That's our senior U.S. correspondent, Mike Wagenheim, live from the White House. More to come from Mike, of course, in the coming hours. Thank you. Benjamin Anthony, your thoughts on these mixed messages? We were talking about it a little bit earlier on in the show, but right now, as Mike was talking about the Marco Rubio factor, he certainly put a spanner in the works with some of his comments about why this operation happened when it did. In effect, what prompted the U.S. president to act. Your thoughts?
Well, I think Secretary Rubio's comments were unfortunate. I think he's a great friend of Israel. I think he's a wonderful and effective Secretary of State, but this was a bit of a faux pas, throwing red meat to the Tucker Carlsons and to the Megyn Kellys and the others in that space. But look, the mixed messaging, Benita, is something that President Trump has said repeatedly he believes in. He has actually criticized heavily, and in my opinion, rightly, American presidents prior to him who have come out and telegraphed very, very clearly what it is they're going to do, what it is they're not going to do, how long it's going to take, what will be the nature of the strike. And I don't see any reason that in a hot war, an American president or any administration should have to tell its enemy precisely that which it intends to do. You know, we bemoan this in the IDF. How often do you hear us talk about us surrendering the element of surprise because of our natural humanity towards civilians in an area we're going to kinetically strike, warning them ahead of time? And I'll give you just one example from the past. You might recall, and the viewers might recall, Secretary of State John Kerry with regard to Syria and their famous red line that then turned pink and was completely erased by President Barack Obama, talking about a pinpoint strike that they're going to carry out against Assad's regime there inside Syria. It turned out to be nonsense. It turned out to be nothing. It was an inaccurate statement at its core. And I think that it's important to note that the people who need to get the messaging right are those who are collaborating over the field of fire. That's the Americans and that's the Israelis. They are uniquely coordinated. What is thrown out as fodder for the general public, to me, is far less important. But I do go back to Secretary Rubio's statement, again, emphasizing he's a great friend of Israel. That was a misstep, but it happens even to the best.
Benjamin, I think you're right. As long as Trump has enough trust and enough political capital and enough runway politically to conduct the war. And I think you're right. In the short term, he has that, even given where the polls are in the United States. But as the war continues, especially if there are casualties, especially if there are setbacks that are evident to the public, there's going to be more and more pressure on him and more good reason for him to be more precise. On the other hand, at that stage, he'll have more information about how the war is going and will be able to narrow his options in a more intelligent way.
Yaakov.
Yeah, just to quickly point out, I don't think there's actually anything wrong with what Secretary Rubio said. I understand that the optics of it don't look good to the anti-Semitic far right, which wants to accuse Israel of every ill in the world. But what did he actually say? He said that as far as Israel is concerned, the missile program became an existential threat, that Israel had already decided that it was on its way to strike, which is absolutely the right thing for Israel to do, and that this obviously carried great weight in the decision-making process. It clearly wasn't the only factor, but it was a very important factor in the decision-making process. In fact, we didn't know about this in the lead-up. This was obviously shrouded, and the number of Iranian missiles that were basically in their arsenal only became declassified a couple of days ago, actually, in response to one of my questions to the military. So at the end of the day, all he said was that Israel was on its way to acting to remove an existential threat, and the United States, for many good reasons, decided to join it. There were the negotiations were going nowhere. The U.S. understands that Iran is a huge threat to itself. So if you take away this, hostile, far-right, whatever you want to call it, distortive messaging, which is always going to frame Israel as wrong and evil, etc., he didn't say anything particularly terrible.
I don't think what the Secretary said was terrible, and I agree with that point. But it goes somewhere between Owen's and Yaakov's points here. It's not just the far right, those who I mentioned, such as Tucker Carlson and others of that ilk. It's also the base. The base, the MAGA base, does not want America dragged into foreign wars at the behest of another country. Now, Yaakov is correct that the idea that America gets on board with Israel's intentions is positive for us, but it's going to be reviled among a segment of the base, not just the furthest fringes of that base. And so for that reason, what I would say about Secretary Rubio's statements is that it was just simply unnecessary. And if you go back to when he was contending for the nomination for the presidency, he is someone who's very, very eloquent when on script. Off script, he does have a little bit of a habit of making rhetorical faux pas. But as I said, it happens to the best of us. And I think that we will leave that in the background when it comes to the headlines soon enough. Just one last point that Owen mentioned. Owen, I totally agree with you, but I think it's very, very early days to worry about what will go on. I just want our audience, Benita, to keep in mind, it's a big headline. Everybody's concerned about Iran, of course, and the strikes against it and what's the end game. But we are so early in this campaign. To me, it's impossible to suggest what might be the outcome, but the mission set has been defined.
Yeah, no, just a very quick point. I agree with everything you said about Rubio. There's an easy answer for Israel and the pro-Israel community in the United States. It would have been Iran's fault. There is no basis for Iran to start attacking American troops after an Israeli attack, just as there's no basis for Iran to start willy-nilly attacking Gulf states after what the United States and Israel have done. And that should be the answer. It was Iran's fault, even if the Marco Rubio story is true. It is Iran's fault that the United States was put in that place, not Israel's.